The battle's unexpected survivor. The air over the barren planet of Eltharn shimmered with heat waves, and the crimson sand stretched endlessly under the unrelenting twin suns. Energy blasts scorched the ground, leaving dark craters in their wake. Acrid smoke hung heavy in the atmosphere, a cruel reminder of the chaos unfolding. The Terran Alliance and the Eltharn Collective had been locked in a brutal war for years, and now this desolate battlefield bore the weight of their conflict. Junior Fleet Officer Ethan Cale crouched behind a jagged boulder, his breathing shallow and controlled. His armor's sensors scanned the surroundings, displaying flickering red markers for potential threats. Every muscle in his body was tense, a coiled spring ready to snap at the slightest movement. He wasn't supposed to be here, this was enemy territory, far from his assigned post. But the fog of war had a way of scattering even the best-laid plans. The screams of battle were distant now, faint echoes of a larger skirmish further across the dunes. Ethan had learned to tune them out, focusing on survival instead. His pulse raced as he stepped out from his cover, his rifle raised, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Then, he heard it, a sound so faint it could have been a trick of the wind. A groan. Instinctively, Ethan froze, his grip tightening on his weapon. The sound came again, weaker this time, like a whisper struggling to rise above the silence. He followed it cautiously, his boots crunching softly against the sand. The source of the noise became clear as he approached the wreckage of an Eltharn hovercraft. The sleek alien vessel was twisted and broken, its metallic surface still smoking from recent combat. Ethan's heart pounded as he neared, every fiber of his training screaming at him to stay away. But curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, pulled him forward. Beneath the crumpled frame of the craft, he saw her. At first, she was just another enemy combatant, clad in silvery armor that glimmered faintly under the suns. But as Ethan drew closer, he noticed details that made his breath hitch, the intricate markings on her armor, the delicate craftsmanship of her helm. She wasn't an ordinary soldier. This was someone important. Her helmet had been knocked off in the crash, revealing pale, almost translucent skin and violet eyes that fluttered open weakly as she became aware of his presence. Blood, darker and thicker than human, seeped from a gash on her forehead, staining the sand beneath her. "Human," she rasped, her voice weak but laced with unmistakable authority. "Leave me. You've won." Ethan hesitated, his rifle aimed at her. 1,000 scenarios raced through his mind. This could be a trap. She might be calling for reinforcements, stalling until her comrades arrived. Every protocol screamed at him to finish her off and move on. But he couldn't. Instead, he lowered his rifle. "You're hurt," he said simply, his voice muffled through his helmet. "You need help." The alien woman's eyes narrowed slightly, her expression a mix of confusion and defiance. "Help?" she echoed, her tone almost mocking despite her pain. "From a human? How noble." Ethan knelt beside her, carefully assessing her injuries. Her right leg was crushed beneath the wreckage, and the burns on her exposed skin told of a battle fought at great personal cost. "I'm not leaving you here," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the unease building in his chest. Her lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. "You'll regret this." "Maybe," Ethan replied, slipping his rifle onto his back. "But I'm not going to regret trying." He worked quickly, clearing debris from around her pinned leg. She winced with every movement, her breaths shallow and labored. When he finally freed her, she slumped against the sand, too weak to resist as Ethan hoisted her onto his shoulders. She was surprisingly light, her form much more fragile than her fierce reputation as an Eltharn suggested. Still, every step was a struggle as Ethan moved across the battlefield. He knew he was a walking target now, a human carrying an alien in plain sight. His heart thudded in his chest, and every shadow seemed to hold the promise of death. "What's your name?" he asked after a long silence, his voice strained from the effort of carrying her. The alien hesitated, as if debating whether to answer. Finally, she said, "Lyrian." "Well, Lyrian," Ethan grunted, "you picked a bad day to crash." Lyrian let out a weak chuckle, though it quickly turned into a pained gasp. "And you, human, you picked a strange time to grow a conscience." They reached the edge of the battlefield, where an abandoned outpost lay nestled against a rocky ridge. The building was old, its walls weathered by years of disuse, but it was intact enough to provide shelter. Ethan kicked the door open and carried Lyrian inside, setting her down on a dusty cot. The alien woman looked at him with weary, half-lidded eyes. Why are you doing this?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He busied himself with the medical supplies, scanning the contents of an ancient first aid kit. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but resolute. "Because every life matters. Even yours." Lyrian stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, exhaustion overtook her, and she slipped into unconsciousness. Ethan sat back, his own fatigue threatening to overwhelm him. The distant sounds of battle had faded completely now, leaving an eerie silence. He had no idea what he had just gotten himself into. But for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was doing something that truly mattered. Shelter in the storm. Ethan Cale moved swiftly through the dim interior of the abandoned outpost, his senses hyper-aware of every creak and groan of the aged structure. The air was stale, carrying the faint metallic tang of disuse. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs stretched like ghostly veils across the corners of the room. The place had likely been a research station before the war had ravaged this planet, but now it was just another remnant of a forgotten time. He set Lyrian down gently on a rusted cot, careful not to jostle her injured leg. Her breath was shallow, her pale skin even more ashen under the flickering emergency lights. The burns along her arms and face were worse than he had initially thought, and blood continued to seep from her wounds despite his makeshift bandages. "Stay with me," Ethan muttered under his breath as he rummaged through the station's remains, looking for anything remotely useful. A cabinet near the back wall yielded a medical kit, its contents outdated but still functional. He also found a portable generator tucked beneath a desk, and after a few tense moments of fiddling with it, the lights flickered on fully, casting the room in a warm glow. The sudden brightness stirred Lyrian. She opened her violet eyes, her gaze weak but sharp enough to focus on Ethan. "You should have left me," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "This mercy will cost you everything." Ethan glanced at her as he unpacked the medical kit. "Maybe. But I'm not in the habit of leaving people to die. Even if they're supposed to be my enemy." Her lips twitched, almost forming a smirk. A human with a conscience. How rare. Ignoring her sarcasm, Ethan began treating her wounds. The burns were the most immediate concern, and he worked quickly, applying salve from the kit. Lyrian flinched at his touch but didn't complain, her eyes studying him intently. "You're not a soldier," she said after a long silence. "Not in the way your kind usually are." Ethan paused, glancing at her. "I've been fighting this war for 7 years. That makes me a soldier, whether I want to be or not." "Yet here you are," she countered, her tone soft but probing. "Carrying me, an Eltharn, out of a battlefield when you could have left me to die. You don't fight like a soldier. You think like something else." Ethan returned to his task, refusing to rise to her bait. "Call it what you want. Right now, my only goal is keeping you alive." Lyrian didn't respond, but her gaze remained on him, filled with a mix of curiosity and confusion. The hours stretched on as Ethan worked to stabilize her condition. He managed to splint her leg, fashioning a crude brace from materials he found in the outpost. The burns were less dire now, thanks to the ointments and dressings he had applied, but Lyrian's condition was far from stable. Her body trembled occasionally, and her breathing remained shallow. Ethan sat back in a chair across the room, exhaustion finally catching up with him. The adrenaline that had carried him this far was fading, leaving behind a gnawing fatigue. He rubbed a hand over his face, his mind racing with questions. What was he doing? Why had he risked his life for her? And what was he supposed to do now? Ethan. Her voice startled him. It was the first time she'd addressed him by name, and hearing it spoken with her alien accent was oddly grounding. He turned to find her watching him, her expression unreadable. Why did you save me? She asked. There was no accusation in her tone this time, only genuine curiosity. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe I'm tired of all the killing. Maybe I saw someone who needed help and decided I couldn't just walk away. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if searching for any trace of deception. You're risking your life by keeping me here. Both our people would see this as treason. Yeah, I figured that, Ethan replied, a wry smile tugging at his lips. But I've already made my choice. Lyrian closed her eyes briefly, a flicker of pain crossing her face. You're a fool, she said softly. Probably, he agreed. But I'm a fool who's still alive. And so are you. Night fell over the planet, and the temperature inside the outpost dropped sharply. Ethan scavenged some old thermal blankets and draped one over Lyrian before wrapping another around himself. He kept the lights dim, not wanting to draw attention to their location. Outside, the desert wind howled, rattling the building's metal framework. As the hours dragged on, Lyrian spoke again, her voice low but steady. My name is Lyrian, she said, as if testing the weight of her own words. I was, commander of the Eltharn Ninth Fleet. And more than that, I am the heir to the throne of the Eltharn Collective. Ethan blinked, sitting up straighter. He had suspected she was someone important, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through him. The heir, he repeated. As in, you're next in line to rule your entire empire? She nodded faintly, her eyes locking onto his. Yes. And if my people knew I was here, wounded and vulnerable, it would be a disaster. Ethan let out a low whistle, running a hand through his hair. So, saving you isn't just a risk, it's a galactic-level risk. Great. Lyrian's lips twitched again, a faint trace of humor in her expression. You could have left me to die, human. But now you're stuck with me. He met her gaze, his own expression firm. I'll take that risk. Because if there's even a chance you can help end this war, then it's worth it. Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't respond. For the first time, there was no trace of sarcasm or defiance in her expression, only quiet contemplation. The night stretched on, and Ethan found himself unable to sleep. He sat by the window, watching the distant horizon for any sign of approaching danger. His rifle was within arm's reach, and his thoughts churned with the weight of the choices he had made. Behind him, Lyrian stirred, her voice breaking the silence. Ethan. Yeah, he replied, turning to look at her. She hesitated, then said, Thank you. Ethan nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. Get some rest, Lyrian. We'll figure out our next move in the morning. As she drifted back to sleep, Ethan kept his vigil, the wind outside howling like a warning. They were alive, for now. But the real battle was only beginning. The Fragile Alliance. The first light of dawn painted the crimson dunes outside the outpost in hues of gold and orange, casting long shadows across the battlefield scars. Ethan Cale stood near the outpost's reinforced window, his rifle slung across his back. The air was eerily quiet now, but it carried a weight of uncertainty. He knew they couldn't stay hidden here forever. Behind him, Lyrian stirred on the cot. Her pale violet eyes opened slowly, locking onto Ethan's silhouette against the light. For a moment, she said nothing, simply observing the human who had risked everything to save her. The soft hum of the outpost's revived systems was the only sound in the room. You haven't slept, she said, her voice still faint but steadier than before. Ethan turned to her, the dark circles under his eyes betraying his exhaustion. "Didn't seem like a good time to let my guard down," he replied. "How are you feeling?" Lyrian shifted slightly, testing her injured leg. Pain flickered across her face, but she held her composure. "Alive. Which is more than I expected." "Good," Ethan said, moving closer to check her vitals. "Because we've got a problem." Her brows furrowed. "What kind of problem?" Ethan gestured toward the console he'd been monitoring. "I've been picking up comm signals from both sides. Search teams are combing the area. They're looking for survivors, and they're not picky about whose side they're on." Lyrian's expression hardened. "If they find us, it'll be the end. For both of us." "Exactly," Ethan said, his tone grim. "We need to move." A difficult partnership. Lyrian struggled to sit upright, her movements slow and deliberate. Ethan moved to help her, but she waved him off with a sharp look. "I can manage," she said, though her voice wavered. Ethan crossed his arms, watching her with a mix of concern and exasperation. "You're not exactly in fighting shape," he pointed out. "If we're going to get out of here, you'll need to rely on me." Her pride flared, evident in the way her jaw tightened. "I've led fleets into battle, human. I don't need your pity." "Good," Ethan shot back. "Because I'm not offering it. I'm offering survival." The tension between them was palpable, but it was undercut by the unspoken understanding that neither of them could make it out alone. Lyrian finally sighed, nodding slightly. "Fine. What's your plan?" Ethan leaned against the console, pulling up a holographic map of the region. "There's an old supply cache about 20 clicks from here. It was abandoned before the war escalated, but if we're lucky, there might still be something we can use: food, weapons, maybe even a working transport." Lyrian studied the map, her sharp gaze analyzing every detail. 20 clicks is a long way on foot," she said. "Especially with patrols in the area." "I know," Ethan admitted. "But staying here isn't an option. Once the search teams get close enough, this place won't be much of a sanctuary." She nodded again, her expression calculating. "Then we'll need to move fast. And we'll need to avoid detection at all costs." Escaping the outpost. Preparing to leave was a painstaking process. Ethan scavenged everything he could from the outpost, loading a small pack with medical supplies, rations, and a few grenades he'd found tucked in a storage locker. Lyrian, still weak but determined, insisted on carrying her own weight. She had managed to fashion a crutch from a piece of broken furniture, leaning on it as she tested her balance. "You're stubborn," Ethan said as he watched her. "And you're irritating," she replied with a faint smirk. Despite the tension between them, there was a growing sense of camaraderie, a fragile alliance born of necessity. They both understood that their survival depended on each other now. As they exited the outpost, the harsh sunlight made them squint. Ethan scanned the horizon with his visor's HUD, his weapon at the ready. The dunes stretched endlessly around them, the occasional jut of rock offering the only cover. "We'll stick to the ridges," he said, pointing to a line of jagged formations to the west. "They'll give us some protection from aerial scans." Lyrian nodded, gripping her makeshift crutch tightly. "Lead the way, human." A test of trust. The trek was grueling. The heat was oppressive, and every step through the loose sand felt like a battle in itself. Ethan kept his pace slow, mindful of Lyrian's injuries. Despite her condition, she kept up surprisingly well, her determination evident in every labored step. "You're tougher than you look," Ethan remarked as they paused for a brief rest in the shadow of a large rock. Lyrian arched a brow. "You expected otherwise?" Ethan shrugged. "I've been told your people rely more on technology than physical endurance." "Guess that was wrong." She let out a dry chuckle. "And I was told humans are little more than brutes with primitive weapons. Yet here you are, saving my life." He smirked. So much for propaganda. Their banter was interrupted by a low rumble in the distance. Ethan froze, his hand instinctively going to his rifle. Lyrian's ears twitched, her heightened senses picking up the sound as well. "Engines," she said quietly. "Close." Ethan nodded, scanning the horizon. A small Eltharn scout craft appeared, skimming low over the dunes. It was sleek and deadly, its twin engines humming with barely restrained power. "Down," Ethan hissed, pulling Lyrian into the shadow of the rock. They pressed themselves against the cool surface, their breaths shallow as the craft passed overhead. The sound grew louder, then faded as it moved away. Ethan exhaled slowly. That was too close. Lyrian glanced at him, her expression serious. "They'll circle back. We need to move." A shared purpose. As they continued their journey, the dynamic between them began to shift. Lyrian, though still wary, seemed to recognize Ethan's competence and resolve. And Ethan, for his part, found himself respecting her resilience and sharp mind. "What's your plan after this?" Lyrian asked suddenly as they neared the supply cache. Ethan didn't answer immediately. "Honestly, I don't know," he said. "This war, it's not what I thought it was. Saving you wasn't part of the plan, but now that I have, I can't just go back to pretending things are black and white." Lyrian studied him for a moment, then nodded. "If we make it out of this alive, perhaps we can figure out a way to end this war. Together." Her words caught him off guard, but he nodded. "Maybe." For the first time since their encounter, there was a glimmer of hope between them. They were no longer just enemies forced into a temporary truce. They were something more, two individuals determined to survive, and perhaps, to change the course of their galaxy. As the supply cache came into view, Ethan and Lyrian braced themselves for what was to come. Their journey was far from over, but for the first time, they faced the uncertainty ahead not as enemies, but as allies. The hidden cache. The old supply cache loomed ahead, half buried in the shifting sands of Althara's endless dunes. The structure was small, a low dome built into the base of a craggy hill. Time and the elements had worn its surface, leaving it cracked and weathered, but it was still intact, a rare treasure in a war-torn world. Ethan Cale scanned the area through the scope of his rifle, searching for any signs of movement. His visor's HUD displayed no life signatures nearby, but years of combat experience had taught him not to trust technology entirely. "It looks abandoned," he said, his voice low. "But that doesn't mean it's safe." Lyrian leaned against her makeshift crutch, her violet eyes narrowing as she studied the structure. "If it were easy, it wouldn't still be here." Ethan smirked at her pragmatism. "Good point." They approached cautiously, keeping to the shadows of the rocks. Every step was deliberate, the silence around them amplifying the crunch of sand under their boots. When they reached the entrance, Ethan examined the thick metal door. It was partially ajar, a gap wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "That's not a good sign," Ethan muttered. "Someone's been here before us." Lyrian adjusted her stance, gripping her crutch tightly. "Can you tell how long ago?" Ethan ran a gloved hand along the edge of the door, noting the scratches and scuffs. "Days, maybe weeks. Hard to say. But we're here now, and we don't have a choice." He pushed the door open slowly, the metal groaning in protest. The stale air that rushed out smelled of rust and decay, but it carried no hint of recent activity. Ethan stepped inside, his rifle raised, with Lyrian close behind. The cache's secrets. The interior was dimly lit by weak emergency lights, their orange glow flickering intermittently. Shelves lined the walls, holding a mix of supplies, many of which had long since spoiled or degraded. Crates were stacked haphazardly in the corners, some marked with faded insignias from both human and Eltharn origins. Ethan moved cautiously, scanning the room for anything of use. His gaze fell on a crate marked with the Terran Alliance's emblem, and he pried it open with the edge of his knife. Inside were ration packs, their seals miraculously intact. "Bingo," he muttered, tossing one to Lyrian. She caught it, inspecting the human writing on the label. "Nutrient paste," she read aloud, her tone skeptical. "Your people have a strange idea of sustenance." Ethan chuckled. "Better than starving." They continued their search, finding a few other useful items, a portable medkit, some spare energy cells, and, to their surprise, a functioning communicator. Ethan examined the device, his brows furrowing. "This could be a game changer," he said. "If we can find the right frequencies, we might be able to pick up intel on enemy movements." Lyrian tilted her head. "Or broadcast our location to anyone listening." Ethan hesitated, nodding. "True. We'll have to be careful." A sudden threat. Just as they began packing their finds, a faint noise reached Ethan's ears, a low hum, barely audible. His blood ran cold. "We've got company," he whispered, motioning for Lyrian to take cover. They pressed themselves against the walls, peering out through the narrow gap in the door. An Eltharn scout craft hovered in the distance, its sleek form gleaming under the harsh sunlight. It was accompanied by two smaller drones, their circular frames zipping through the air with precision. "They're sweeping the area," Lyrian murmured. "They must have picked up on the outpost's power signature." Ethan cursed under his breath. "We need to get out of here. Now." Lyrian's gaze hardened. "If we leave, they'll follow our trail. And if they find us, they'll call reinforcements." Ethan nodded, already weighing their limited options. "Then we take them out before they can report back." Lyrian's brows rose in surprise. "Against a scout craft and two drones? You're either brave or reckless." "Maybe both," Ethan said with a grin, checking his rifle's charge. "But if we work together, we might stand a chance." The ambush. Ethan led Lyrian out of the cache through a side exit, guiding her to a higher vantage point among the rocks. From there, they had a clear view of the approaching craft. The drones moved in calculated patterns, their scanners sweeping the ground methodically. "We'll need to disable the drones first," Ethan whispered, handing Lyrian one of the grenades he had found earlier. "Can you handle this?" She took it without hesitation, her fingers brushing against his briefly. "I've thrown a grenade or two in my time, human." "Good," Ethan replied, his grin returning. "Wait for my signal." He positioned himself behind a boulder, aiming his rifle at the closest drone. He steadied his breathing, counting the seconds until the drone was perfectly in his sights. Then he fired. The energy blast struck true, the drone exploding in a shower of sparks. Before the second drone could react, Lyrian hurled the grenade with precision, and it detonated midair, taking the second drone with it. The scout craft spun around, its engines roaring as it locked onto their position. Ethan didn't wait for it to fire. He sprinted across the rocks, drawing its attention while Lyrian scrambled to a new vantage point. The craft's pulse cannons unleashed a volley, blasting the ground around Ethan as he narrowly dodged the shots. Lyrian, now in position, raised a plasma pistol she had scavenged from the cache. With calm precision, she fired at the craft's undercarriage, hitting one of its stabilizers. The craft wobbled, struggling to stay aloft. "Now!" Ethan shouted, tossing a grenade of his own. The explosion engulfed the craft, sending it crashing into the sand with a deafening thud. Victory and consequences. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Ethan and Lyrian remained still for a moment, their eyes scanning the wreckage for any signs of movement. When none came, Ethan let out a long breath, leaning against a rock to steady himself. "Well," he said, his voice tinged with exhaustion, "that wasn't so bad." Lyrian approached him, her movements slow but steady. "You call that not so bad?" she asked, arching a brow. Ethan grinned despite himself. "We're alive, aren't we?" She shook her head but didn't argue. Instead, she extended a hand, and Ethan clasped it firmly. In that moment, the barriers between them seemed to fade, replaced by a growing trust. "We should move," Lyrian said after a moment. "That crash will draw attention." "Agreed," Ethan replied, grabbing their supplies. "Let's keep going. There's still a long way to go." As they disappeared into the dunes, the wreckage of the scout craft smoldered behind them. They both knew their journey was far from over, but for the first time, they had proven they could face the challenges ahead, together. The searing heat of the twin suns bore down on Ethan and Lyrian as they trudged through the crimson dunes, their shadows stretching long against the shifting sands. Each step was an act of will, the loose terrain making progress slow and grueling. The silence between them was heavy but not hostile, they both knew the stakes were too high for idle conversation. Ethan occasionally glanced over at Lyrian, watching her navigate the unforgiving terrain with a determination that belied her injuries. Her makeshift crutch sank into the sand with each step, but she pressed forward, her jaw set in a way that reminded him of seasoned human soldiers. Her resilience was impressive, but Ethan couldn't shake the worry gnawing at the back of his mind. She was still weak, and they were far from safe. The crash site of the scout craft was already miles behind them, its wreckage little more than a memory on the horizon. But they both knew it wouldn't stay forgotten for long. Patrols from both sides would converge on the area soon enough, drawn by the unmistakable signs of a battle. That left them with a dwindling window to put as much distance as possible between themselves and their pursuers. As the hours stretched on, the landscape began to shift. The dunes gave way to jagged ridges and rocky outcroppings, offering a reprieve from the relentless sand but creating new challenges in the form of uneven terrain. Ethan scanned the area, his visor displaying faint heat signatures from the rocks, the lingering warmth of the sun captured by the mineral-rich stone. Lyrian stumbled, catching herself against one of the larger rocks. Ethan was at her side in an instant, his hand steadying her before she could fall completely. She glanced at him, her expression a mix of frustration and reluctant gratitude. "I'm fine," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. "You're not," Ethan replied, his voice calm but firm. "And pretending you are won't help us. Rest for a minute." She hesitated, clearly torn between her pride and the reality of her condition. Finally, she relented, lowering herself onto a nearby boulder. Ethan crouched a few feet away, scanning the horizon while keeping an ear tuned to their surroundings. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying with it a faint, metallic tang that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Lyrian broke the silence after a moment, her voice quieter than usual. "You're not what I expected from a human soldier." Ethan glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. "And what exactly were you expecting?" She smirked faintly, though the expression didn't quite reach her eyes. "Arrogance. Cruelty. A thirst for blood. That's what your kind has shown us in this war." Ethan sighed, resting his arms on his knees. "That's what war does to people. It strips away the parts that make us human. Or Eltharn, I guess. Turns us into something else." Lyrian studied him, her violet eyes searching his face as if trying to decipher a puzzle. "You speak as though you hate this war." "I do," Ethan admitted. "I've seen too much of it. Lost too much to it. But hating it doesn't make it go away." Her expression softened, and for a brief moment, the weight of her title and her responsibilities seemed to lift. She was no longer the heir to the Eltharn throne, but simply a person trying to survive in a galaxy that seemed determined to tear itself apart. The moment was broken by the distant whine of engines, faint but unmistakable. Ethan tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. Lyrian straightened as well, her injuries momentarily forgotten. "They're coming," she said, her voice tight. "Yeah," Ethan replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "And they're not far." They scrambled to their feet, exhaustion momentarily giving way to adrenaline. Ethan led the way, guiding them into the shadow of the rocky outcroppings. The terrain grew steeper, forcing them to climb in places, but the added elevation provided them with a better vantage point. They reached a narrow ledge overlooking a small valley. From there, they could see the source of the noise, a Terran scout vehicle, sleek and armed, its searchlights sweeping the area below. Behind it, two smaller drones hovered, their scanners sweeping in rhythmic patterns. Ethan swore under his breath. "We don't have the firepower to take that thing head-on." Lyrian's gaze remained fixed on the scout vehicle, her mind working quickly. "We don't need to destroy it. We just need to delay it long enough to escape." Ethan turned to her, his expression skeptical. "And how do you suggest we do that?" She reached into the small pack slung over her shoulder, pulling out one of the devices they had scavenged from the supply cache. It was a jammer, an old but functional piece of Eltharn tech designed to disrupt enemy communications and targeting systems. "This," she said, holding it up. "If I can get close enough to deploy it, the scout vehicle will lose its ability to coordinate with the drones. That should give us enough time to slip away." Ethan frowned, glancing between her and the jammer. "That's a lot of risk for a small window of opportunity." "Do you have a better idea?" she countered, her tone sharp. He didn't. With a resigned nod, he adjusted the strap on his rifle. "Fine. But I'm not letting you do it alone. We'll move together." They descended into the valley carefully, sticking to the shadows as they moved closer to the scout vehicle. The whine of its engines grew louder, the searchlights casting stark beams of light across the rocky terrain. Ethan signaled for Lyrian to stay low, and they crept forward, their movements synchronized despite their different training. When they were within range, Lyrian activated the jammer, its faint hum barely audible over the sound of the scout vehicle. She hesitated for a moment, glancing at Ethan. "Now," she whispered. Ethan nodded, providing cover as she hurled the device toward the vehicle. It landed with a clatter, and within seconds, the jammer activated. The scout vehicle's lights flickered erratically, and the drones veered off course, their synchronized movements dissolving into chaos. "Move!" Ethan shouted, pulling Lyrian to her feet as the vehicle's systems struggled to compensate. They sprinted back toward the ridge, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, the scout vehicle's engines roared in frustration, but it was clear the jammer had done its job. When they finally reached the safety of the rocks, Ethan turned to Lyrian, his chest heaving. "You're insane, you know that." She gave him a tired but triumphant smile. "Insane enough to keep us alive." For the first time, Ethan laughed, a sound that felt foreign after so much time spent in the shadow of war. "Fair enough." As they disappeared into the rugged terrain, leaving the scout vehicle and its drones behind, they both knew their journey was far from over. But for the first time, they felt like they had a fighting chance. Together. The jagged ridges gave way to a rocky plateau, its surface cracked and uneven, scattered with remnants of ancient structures long eroded by time. The winds carried a biting chill now, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the dunes. Ethan and Lyrian pressed forward, their pace slower but steady. The adrenaline from their escape was wearing off, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Lyrian leaned more heavily on her makeshift crutch, her face pale but resolute. Ethan kept a careful eye on her, adjusting his pace to match hers without comment. He could see the strain in her every movement, the toll their relentless journey had taken on her injured body. Still, she hadn't uttered a single word of complaint. In the distance, the landscape shifted again. A narrow canyon cut through the plateau, its walls steep and shadowed. Ethan stopped, scanning the area with his rifle at the ready. The canyon would offer cover, but it was also a perfect place for an ambush. "This is the only way through," he said, glancing back at Lyrian. "But it's going to be tight. If anyone's waiting for us, we'll have nowhere to run." Lyrian straightened, her grip on the crutch firm. "Then we'd better make sure we're faster than they are." Ethan smirked despite himself. You've got a way of making everything sound easier than it is. Survival doesn't care about easy, she replied, her tone even. They entered the canyon cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the loose gravel underfoot. The walls loomed high above them, their surfaces pockmarked with natural formations that cast deep shadows. The air here was cooler, carrying the faint scent of damp stone. Ethan's visor tracked faint heat signatures along the canyon walls, but none of them indicated immediate threats. Still, his instincts kept him on edge. Every sound, the scrape of their boots, the occasional tumble of pebbles, seemed amplified in the enclosed space. They were about halfway through when the first shot rang out. Ethan reacted instantly, pulling Lyrian into cover behind a large boulder. Energy blasts ricocheted off the canyon walls, sending sparks flying. He peeked around the edge, spotting 3 figures moving along the higher ridges. Their sleek armor and precise movements marked them as Eltharn soldiers, likely a reconnaissance team. "They found us," Ethan muttered, his voice tight. "We've got 3 on the ridge, and they've got the high ground." Lyrian's expression darkened as she leaned against the boulder, her mind racing. "If they report back, more will come. We can't let that happen." Ethan nodded, already formulating a plan. "I'll draw their fire. You stay here." Her eyes widened in protest. "You can't take them on alone." "Watch me," Ethan said, his voice firm. "Stay low, and when you see an opening, take it." Before she could argue further, Ethan darted out from cover, his rifle blazing. He fired at the ridge, forcing the Eltharn soldiers to duck for cover. Their return fire was immediate and precise, but Ethan moved unpredictably, using the canyon's natural formations to stay one step ahead. Lyrian watched him with a mixture of awe and frustration. Despite his reckless approach, Ethan's movements were calculated, his aim steady even under heavy fire. She could see now why he had survived so long in a war that claimed so many. Summoning her strength, she reached for the plasma pistol holstered at her side. Her injuries screamed in protest, but she gritted her teeth and pushed through the pain. If Ethan could risk his life to protect her, she wasn't about to sit idle. As the Eltharn soldiers focused on Ethan, Lyrian took careful aim at one of the figures. Her shot was true, striking the soldier in the shoulder and sending them tumbling from the ridge. The sudden shift in momentum gave Ethan the opening he needed. He took out another soldier with a well-placed shot, leaving only one remaining. The last soldier hesitated, clearly weighing their odds against the determined pair below. Before they could decide, Ethan fired again, and the figure crumpled to the ground. The canyon fell silent once more, save for the echoes of the battle fading into the distance. Ethan returned to Lyrian, his chest heaving. "Nice shot," he said, offering her a hand. She took it, allowing him to help her to her feet. "I couldn't let you have all the fun," she said, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. Ethan laughed, though it was tinged with relief. "Let's hope that was the last of them." They continued through the canyon, their senses heightened for any signs of further pursuit. The encounter had left them both drained, but there was no time to rest. Every second spent in the open increased the risk of discovery. When they finally emerged on the other side, the sight before them took them by surprise. Nestled in a hidden valley was a settlement, small and battered, but alive. Smoke curled from makeshift chimneys, and the faint hum of generators filled the air. People moved about, their figures clad in a mix of Terran and Eltharn garments. Ethan and Lyrian exchanged a glance, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. This wasn't an ordinary settlement. This was a place where humans and Eltharn coexisted, something they had both thought impossible. As they approached, a figure stepped forward to meet them, their features partially obscured by a hood. "Travelers," the figure said, their voice calm but wary. "What brings you here?" Ethan hesitated, unsure how to answer. But Lyrian spoke first, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "We're looking for refuge. And perhaps, allies." The figure studied them for a moment before nodding. You'll find both here. But be warned, trust is earned, not given. Ethan and Lyrian stepped into the settlement, their journey far from over but with a renewed sense of purpose. They had found something unexpected. A glimmer of hope in a galaxy consumed by war. Together, they would see where this fragile alliance could lead. The hidden settlement buzzed with cautious energy as Ethan and Lyrian were ushered into its heart. The structures were cobbled together from salvaged materials, bits of Terran metal plating fused with the smooth, iridescent alloys of Eltharn origin. It was a place born of necessity, not design, and it was alive with quiet defiance. The figure who had greeted them led them to a central hall, a spacious but dimly lit room that seemed to serve as both a gathering place and a command center. Humans and Eltharn alike stood around a holographic table, their faces etched with determination and weariness. Conversation ceased as the pair entered, and all eyes turned to them. "Who are they?" one of the humans asked, a gruff man with a weathered face. His hand hovered near the pistol on his belt. "They're fugitives," the hooded figure replied. "And they're carrying the scars of the war. That makes them worth listening to." Lyrian stepped forward, her movements slow but deliberate. Her gaze swept across the room, meeting the skeptical eyes of those assembled. "I am Lyrian of the Eltharn Collective," she said, her voice steady. "Heir to the throne of my people." Her words drew murmurs from the crowd, a ripple of unease passing through the room. Ethan stepped up beside her, his rifle slung across his back but his posture protective. "And I'm Ethan Kale, Terran Fleet Officer. We didn't come here to fight. We came because we believe there's a way to end this war." The murmurs grew louder, but a sharp gesture from the hooded figure silenced them. The figure pulled back their hood, revealing the angular features of an older Eltharn woman. Her silver hair framed a face lined with age and experience. "End the war?" she asked, her tone skeptical. Bold words from a soldier and a princess. "It's not just words," Ethan said, his voice firm. "We've seen what this war has done to both our people. The destruction, the loss, it can't go on. We need to find another way." "And you think you found it?" the older woman pressed, her violet eyes narrowing. Lyrian nodded. "We've seen each other's memories, felt each other's pain. The technology of my people allowed us to connect on a level neither of us thought possible. It showed us the truth, this war is built on fear and misunderstanding, but it doesn't have to continue." Her words hung in the air, heavy with conviction. The room fell silent as those present absorbed the implications. Finally, the older woman spoke again. "You've come a long way to deliver this message. But words alone won't end a war." Ethan nodded. "That's why we're not just talking. We're here to build something, a movement. A coalition of people who believe that peace is worth fighting for." The next few days in the settlement were a blur of planning and introductions. Ethan and Lyrian quickly realized that the people here were no strangers to hardship. They had fled their homes, their armies, and their nations, seeking refuge from the endless cycle of violence. But their survival had come at a cost, supplies were scarce, and trust was even scarcer. Lyrian spent much of her time among the Eltharn refugees, her presence stirring both awe and unease. For many, she was a symbol of the empire they had abandoned, a reminder of the rigid hierarchy they had sought to escape. But as she spoke with them, her sincerity began to chip away at their distrust. Ethan, meanwhile, worked to earn the trust of the humans in the settlement. He shared stories of his time on the front lines, of the friends he had lost and the disillusionment that had driven him to question everything he had been taught. His straightforward honesty resonated with them, breaking down barriers that had seemed insurmountable. One evening, as the settlement gathered around a fire in the central square, Lyrian addressed the crowd. Her voice carried over the crackling flames, steady and clear despite the weight of her words. "We are told that peace is impossible," she began. "That humans and Eltharn are too different to coexist. But look around you. This place, this settlement, it's proof that they're wrong. We've already taken the first step. Now we must take the next. Ethan stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the gathered faces. We can't do this alone. The two of us may have started this journey, but it's going to take all of us to finish it. If we work together, if we trust each other, we can build something stronger than the fear and hatred that have driven this war. The firelight reflected in the faces of the crowd, their expressions a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Slowly, one by one, they began to nod. It wasn't a resounding cheer or a dramatic rallying cry, but it was enough. A spark had been lit, small but undeniable. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Ethan and Lyrian worked tirelessly to solidify their coalition, reaching out to other settlements and gathering resources. They faced setbacks and betrayals, but they also found allies, people on both sides who were tired of fighting and willing to risk everything for a chance at peace. Through it all, Ethan and Lyrian's bond deepened. They were no longer just allies forced together by circumstance. They had become partners, their shared vision of a better future binding them in a way that transcended their differences. As their movement grew, so did the danger. The Terran Alliance and the Eltharn Collective both took notice, branding them as traitors and launching efforts to dismantle their fragile coalition. But the harder their enemies pushed, the more determined Ethan and Lyrian became. One night, as they prepared for a critical mission to deliver their message to a broader audience, Ethan turned to Lyrian. "Do you ever think about how we got here?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with wonder. "How two people who were supposed to hate each other ended up fighting for the same cause?" Lyrian met his gaze, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Every day," she said. "And it only makes me more certain that we're doing the right thing." Ethan nodded, his resolve strengthening. "Then let's make it count." Together, they stepped into the unknown, carrying the hopes of their people and the fragile dream of a united future. The path ahead was uncertain, but they were ready to face it. For the first time in years, they believed that peace was not just a distant possibility, it was a goal worth fighting for.